Hello everyone, and welcome to part 11 in our series on Dante's Inferno. Today we're going to cover the rest of Canto 5 and finally figure out exactly how Francesca and Paolo got into their love predicament. So as we continue to read today, we're going to be focusing again on the moment in which Francesca and Paolo fall in love with one another. So we're going to be looking at lines 97 through 127 of the 5th canto. You can find these on page 751 to page 752 of your literature textbook. These words were borne across from them to us. When I had heard those afflicted souls, I lowered my head and held it so till I heard the voice of the poet ask, "What are you thinking?" I answered, "Alas, that sweet conceptions and passions so deep should bring them here." Then, looking up toward the lovers, "Francesca, your suffering makes me weep for sorrow and pity. But tell me, in the hours of sweetest sighing, how and in what shape or manner did love first show you those desires so hemmed by doubt?" And she to me, "No sadness is greater than in misery to rehearse memories of joy, as your teacher well can witness. But if you have so great a craving to measure our love's first fruit, I'll tell it, with the fitness of one who weeps and tells. One day, for pleasure, we read of Lancelot, by love constrained, alone, suspecting nothing, at our leisure. Sometimes at what we read our glances joined, looking from the book each to the other's eyes, and then the color in our faces drained. But one particular moment alone it was defeated us. The longed-for smile, it said, was kissed by that most noble lover. At this one who now will never leave my side, kissed my mouth, trembling. Agelotto that book, and so was he who wrote it. That day we read no further." All the while the one shade spoke. The other at her side was weeping. My pity overwhelmed me, and I felt myself go slack. Swooning as in death, I fell like a dying body. So we're going to go ahead and dive into these final stanzas, and we see here that Francesca is going to tell the story of how they fell in love. And on the first looking at their moment of passion, we feel immense pity for her and for him, as well we should, because remember, Dante the Pilgrim, through his words and his actions, also shows us that he feels immense pity for them. And we see that in the beginning when he refers to them as these afflicted souls. So afflicted meaning one who is stricken by something, in this case stricken by their punishment in hell. And as a result of realizing this, he lowers his head. And this could be interpreted as one, either a sign of shame, so maybe shame in the fact that he himself is alive and free from hell while they are not, but also this showing of pity that he feels for them that's going to continue through the rest of Canto 5. And then we're brought back to reality a bit by Virgil. And this is one of the few moments in which he speaks to Dante in this canto, which is unusual because remember, he is usually speaking to Dante rather, and to guide him through what he's seeing. And here he asks Dante, "What are you thinking?" And this is an important question because he's trying to help Dante understand that the feelings he's going through right now are pity, feelings he's been warned against by not only Virgil himself in the beginning, right? Leave all fear and cowardice, but also warned by Minos. Don't trust the words that you hear. And Dante reveals exactly what he's feeling with this first word, alas. And this is some utterance, right, that you would say if you feel intense grief or pity for someone. And this continues here, and he refers to this meeting of Francesca and Paolo and the fact that such sweet conceptions and passions so deep could wind them up here, and here we know being hell. And it's important that we look at that word conception. And conception can be interpreted either as these thoughts that you have or even more so your intentions. So what are your plans? And so Dante the Pilgrim then is referring to this moment of, if we're speaking about it plainly, as adultery. Remember, Francesca is married and married to Paolo's brother, no less. that he refers to these moments as sweet, and this passion between them as one that's deeply rooted within them. And we need to never lose sight of the fact that Dante the Pilgrim is going to turn away from identifying this moment as sin, and hence this is what allows him to feel pity for them. But Dante the poet, on the other hand, is never going to let us forget the fact that they have committed a carnal sin, this sin of lust, and hence why they end up where they do. And then we turn back to his attention on Francesca and Paolo. And he refers to their suffering. And here it's important to understand that he's referring not to the suffering of their love together in life, but now their punishment in death, that they're forced to be side by side with one another. And thinking about their suffering, their torment, causes Dante to weep with sorrow and pity. And this urges him then to want to understand what exactly in those hours of sweetest sighing, or in those hours of thinking upon the love they feel for one another, what is it that made them finally take that leap into consummating their love? And so here we need to highlight not just the fact that Dante feels pity for Francesca and for Paolo, but also the fact that they are supposed to be suffering. So while this suffering evokes in Dante pity, it's the very fact of their suffering that hell is created for, right? We understand that Dante, the poet, describes hell as being created by God for divine justice. So no one here in hell is receiving punishment that they have not earned in life. But the way in which Francesca is going to tell their story, and the way in which Dante the Pilgrim feels so emotionally attached to them, is going to allow us as the reader, for a moment at least, to forget that Francesca and Paolo are receiving punishment from their own actions, their own choices. Turning then to our worksheet for today. We don't really have anything so much to discuss in terms of Francesca and Paolo's speech and action yet, although we can understand that their telling of this story is going to help Dante the Pilgrim and us as the reader, for a moment, forget the fact that they are in a place where they have earned their suffering. So this pity that we feel and that we've been warned against, we shouldn't be feeling. And we're also going to look at Dante's speech and his actions. And we see that, at least for Dante the Pilgrim, that he continues to show this immense pity, so much so that it shows not just in his actions, right? That he lowers his head, that he thinks of these people as being afflicted souls, people who are receiving undue punishment. But it also shows in his words that he refers to their adultery in such romantic and light and sweet terms. Sweet conceptions and thoughts. How could they end you up here in hell? This makes no sense to me, so much so that it causes me to weep. And so now we come to Dante's question. And so he's saying, how did love first show you the desires that were so hemmed by doubt? And we need to translate this question in a little bit to understand what he's asking. So he's saying, how did love, capitalized, so we know he's referring to it as this proper noun, how did this personification of love show you the intimate desires or longings that you had hemmed in or pulled back because of your doubt? So here he's in a sense giving Francesca and Paolo the good of thinking that they at least tried to hem in their desire, so giving them the benefit of the doubt in this case. And she is going to reply to him that what he is asking is not going to be easy to tell. So although he couches his words in a way that describes their love as innocent, telling this story is nonetheless still difficult for Francesca. And she points out to Virgil and she says, I know this well, and your teacher too knows this. Because remember, Virgil himself does not escape from hell. He finds himself in the very first circle, that circle of limbo. And then she dives in and says, but. So although this is deeply painful for me, it's going to be even worse because I'm remembering these times of happiness in the literal definition of sorrow. If your craving for knowledge is so great, I will tell you. And it's interesting that she uses this word craving, because remember, circle 2 is for those who have committed the sin of lust, who have been unable to control their physical cravings. So we could think about Francesca's words as being very sweet on the surface, right? This is difficult for me, but because you want to know so badly, I'll tell you. But we also need to look at the underlying thing of what she's saying, because remember, we need not trust everything that they say. So one, when we look at her calling out Virgil, we could either look at this as her saying, Virgil understands well what I mean, or maybe, perhaps it's a jibe at Virgil, right? So I am in hell, but look at that person who is leading you. He's also there with us, right? But then also acknowledging the fact that Dante's craving is not so different from theirs. Just as they craved to be with one another, Dante is now craving to understand the moment in which they fell in love. And then speaking of that word love, we need to constantly ask ourselves, yes, she and Dante, for that matter, present their story as one of love. But remember, Dante the poet still places them in hell. So really, is it a story of pure love, this courtly love vision that Dante the poet established in his writing, or is it something different, this perverted or twisted view of courtly love? Because remember, courtly love was never meant to be consummated, but Francesca and Paolo cross that line, hence why they find themselves in hell. And so now she's going to begin to tell her story, and she is reminding us that this is going to be a thing that's painful for her to tell. So she's going to be weeping and crying as she does. And she begins by saying what story they were reading. And that's the story of Lancelot. And I talked about this a little bit in class before our break. But just a reminder, Lancelot is one of the most noble knights in King Arthur's circle. And in fact, he's one of King Arthur's closest friends and confidants, so someone he would have trusted. And Lancelot falls madly in love with King Arthur's wife, Guinevere. So being the knight that he is and looking upon courtly love, he tries to constrain the feelings he has for her, never crossing that line. However, we're going to find out in a moment that that is easier said than done, and by the end of their story, Lancelot and Guinevere both pay the consequence for not protecting their courtly love, right? For letting it go into that realm of consummation, which they should not have. And it's also interesting that she is switching back to her and Paolo and saying that we were alone, that we suspected nothing. And again, as we read this in this first glance, we feel pity and sorrow for them, right? They're just simply reading this book about two forbidden lovers, star-crossed lovers, right? And that they're unaware of their feelings. And that it's the story itself that brings on their desire for one another. But again, we need to look at this with a grain of salt, right? So yes, when we read this, love is the first thing that comes to mind. But also remember, this love ends with them in hell. So it's not this pure love that we see, for example, between Dante the poet and Beatrice. There's something off about it. So jumping then to our worksheet, we again notice that Dante reveals his pity for their plight or for their suffering. And his words even suggest that their love for one another was out of their control, that at least they tried to hem it in, but love brought it out for them. We also see that for these lovers, this memory is a painful one. So their romantic feelings and their moment of, for better lack of a word, giving in to those desires, right, is something that's painful to discuss. But we also see that she uses these interesting statements, right? So in a sense, distancing her and Paolo away from their action, right? It was out of their control. And this is interesting too, because remember, lust as a sin for Dante was defined as these emotions and these physical desires that are out of control. And then we see exactly what this love is doing to them. So they are reading this book, they look up from the book to one another, they catch each other's eyes, quickly glance down, the color drains from their faces so they're embarrassed, they've been caught, and all of this should be giving in our minds this image of this innocent love. We see the beginning moments of their feelings develop for one another, right? Think of any really cheesy romantic comedy you've ever watched, that moment where they both like each other but no one knows. This is the way that Francesca is describing their love. And it makes it more palatable for us. And even by now, we've completely forgotten the fact that she was already married to somebody else. And this person that she's engaging in romantic feelings with is her husband's brother, right? So again, their love trumping this idea of their betrayal. And then we finally see the moment that does them in. And it's when they come to this particular line in the story. The longed for smile of the lover was kissed by that most noble lover. And this is, again, a reference to the moment when Lancelot and Guinevere cross those courtly love boundaries and they finally kiss one another. And I've given you an image of a popular painting of that moment there. And it's interesting to note, right? Again, similar situations. Someone who is married and the person that they now have feelings for is emotionally connected to their husband. So again, this act of betrayal. And so love, in a sense, she's saying, defeats their will to do what's right. So again, distancing their responsibility. And she's going to talk later, again, giving responsibility to others. And one of the people that she is going to blame for their lack of control is the poet responsible for first writing this story of Lancelot and Guinevere. And that is a French poet, Troyer. And he is noted as the one who possibly even came up with this story of these two lovers. And now she turns back to their story. So again, shifting away from Lancelot and Guinevere, back towards herself and Paolo. And she says, as a result, this one, meaning Paolo, who will never leave my side, kissed my mouth, trembling. So she's saying that in this moment, Paolo, for lack of control, right, we see that he's trembling, perhaps he's fearful or anxious, he kisses her. And after this kiss, she begins to curse. Not only the book and the person who wrote it, so again referring to Troyer, but also to a certain character in that story, Galotto. And he was the person who acted as this go-between between Lancelot and Guinevere, so the person who would have passed their courtly love letters back and forth. So again, shifting any fault away from the two of them and placing it onto other people. So this idea that their love for one another was out of their control. So nothing really new here in terms of Dante, but again we see this image of innocent love being portrayed, right? And this love without control, that they fall into one another's arms by no fault of their own. They simply couldn't control their desires. And then we come to the last few verses of Canto 5, and we see the peak of Dante's emotional feeling. So before we get to Dante, though, we also see that Paolo, who interestingly enough, Francesca never refers to by name. And Dante is going to fail to do so as well, for the most part, right? That this other at her side was weeping. So the whole entire time Francesca is recalling their love, it doesn't bring out feelings of joy for either of them. It only brings up weeping. And we can think of that as part of their punishment, right? That their love wasn't one that was pure and abided by those cultural and religious boundaries, but one that crossed the line. And this evokes pity in Dante, so much so, and here we see another simile being used, that he is going to once again faint. And he faints like a dying body. So his pity is so intense that he is physically impacted by it. So his first instance of fainting in the Inferno happens out of fear, right? When the earth begins to shake and crack and this red light comes emerging from the ground. Now we see that his fainting is going to be caused by his pity. the fact that he is not able to control his emotions and heed the warnings of Minos and of Virgil. And I think it's interesting too, and this is the last point I'll make, that he falls like a dying body. And this is going to be reminiscent of the moment where Francesca and Paolo also meet their fate. Because remember, they are happened upon by Francesca's husband, who subsequently stabs them to death. So we see here that Dante's pity reaches its highest peak, meaning that he is physically overcome by his pity, and it results in him fainting once again. We also see that Francesca and Paolo feel sorrow for their fate, for the love that cost them everything, and that's wound them up in hell. And interesting to note the fact that when they, or really Francesca, talk about the love that they share, it's never in terms of a deep longing and passion that they're both proud of, that they enter into willingly. Although reading this story, we get this image of, oh, this is so sweet, what a romantic story. If we realize the context, it's not so romantic, because they wind themselves up in hell for the rest of eternity. And their punishment is to be stuck with one another, never losing sight of what wound them up in hell in the first place. So now that we've reached the end of Canto 5, you'll see that you have 3 thinking through the literature questions in your textbook. The first one is simply asking for your opinion. So how did you react to Francesca and Paolo? Were you completely convinced by their love story, or was something left wanting? In the second question, you're given a quote by Joseph Campbell, who is one of the leading writers about mythology. And he says that the most famous lines in Dante are the lines of Francesca and Paolo describing their love. Why do you think it is that these lines are so appealing to many readers? And I would also add, do you agree with Joseph Campbell's statement based on what we've read so far? Do you really think these are the most famous lines? And then the third question is asking you to think of what these winds might represent in this second circle. That's it for video number 11 and for Canto 5. In our next video, we'll begin Canto 34. So we're going to jump all the way to the very last canto in the Inferno. And this is where we finally come to that deepest, darkest layer or circle of hell reserved for the betrayers, and where we're finally going to meet Lucifer. So please don't forget to download the worksheet for video 12, and I'll see you next time.